All right, so in the slide, it basically shows again what I discussed in the previous video. There are two waves, and this is the first wave. Again, let's remind ourselves that these were the Vietnamese refugees who had close connections with the US government, the US military, and certainly the South Vietnamese government. And they were in immediate danger of being persecuted and killed, and therefore they fled right away. You see some Hmong refugees coming, but it's mostly South Vietnamese. And let's remind ourselves they're more elite in their background, more fluent in their English skills. And this is all important because it's going to help them adapt in America, right? Middle class background, having some transferable job skills in the United States. And that'll compare to the second generation or second wave, excuse me, and that's here. A lot of them were the boat people. But we also mentioned, Cambodian Hmong. And among the Vietnamese, it's important to note that many of them were ethnic Chinese. In fact, if you meet someone today in the United States, you say, oh, yeah, my parents or grandparents perhaps fled as a boat person. They might be ethnic Chinese, okay, because there was a high percentage of them. Um, All right, they're less educated, formal education, no language skills pretty much, and therefore that affects their status and adaptation when they come to the United States, okay, having no marketable job skills. And we also note the importance of this act passed by President Carter. At the time, the Refugee Act of 1980 raised the ceiling from 17,000 to 50,000. But it also led in less aid uh, that was guaranteed for the refugees. So this is going to affect their settlement, obviously. Now, in the previous video, I mentioned that there's going to be problems of adaptation, especially for the second wave, due to the fact that you see plummeting um, approval rates among Americans. You have this economic crisis that's afflicting the country. You see a backlash against some civil rights programs and so forth. Okay, so you have a constellation of factors involved that's going to affect the refugees, not only reception in the United States, but certainly their settlement and their adaptation to U.S. society in general. Okay, so in light of this fact that I just mentioned, it was felt that the refugees had to become economically independent and as, quote, invisible, unquote, as possible. Okay. Factors I just mentioned, such as, economic problems and low approval rate, led to the government deciding that, let's remember the government is behind this, right? As well as VOLAGs, I should mention, which are non-governmental, but they're voluntary associations. All right, so you have these factors influencing the decision to make refugees economically independent and invisible as possible. So, what's the solution to this? Well, it was felt that in order to make them economically independent and to not be so visible in the public eye, well, let's encourage assimilation as quickly as possible. So this was the strategy overall, okay, what mentioned here. But that's the question, how do you assimilate them quickly? Well, you did have this federal program called the Federal Resettlement Program. Okay, the Federal Resettlement Program. As the name suggests, it's in charge of resettling them. And once they resettle the United States, there's going to be certain um, policies and programs in effect that will make or that will have the aim of making them, quote, invisible while assimilating as much as possible. All right, so how are they going to do this again? Well, the answer was to disperse them widely throughout the country. Again, you don't want to concentrate them in one, let's say, urban area altogether, right? Um, you want to disperse them. It was felt among, let's say, the Federal Resettlement Program policymakers that through dispersal throughout the country, it would make them less visible in the public eye, right? In other words, you don't want to form a critical mass of, let's say, refugee communities in a place like Los Angeles or San Francisco, all right? But what this is going to do is affect the natural kinship networks, if you will, among the refugees, the Vietnamese refugees, among the Cambodian. Okay, because of their wide dispersal, excuse me, you're going to see them less able to form community of co-ethnics. Okay, and that's going to greatly affect them. They're already suffering from many of them suffering from trauma, right? This dislocation, right? Sudden dislocation from their home country. And then they're coming to this very modernized, right, country and wealthy country, and they're the racial other, right? And again, it reminds Americans of the Vietnam War, which they choose to put in their rearview mirror, so to speak. Okay, but with wide dispersal, you get even every state in the country receiving at least 100 refugees. Okay, so it's important to note here before the war in Indochina, the U.S. really didn't have a a a big community of Indochinese persons. Okay, unlike say Jewish, right? So when they come over here, it's really starting from anew. All right. So with the funding, the funding was basically covering basic needs like food and clothing, occupational training or retraining, perhaps, English language school, even formal education, right? But this is going to dry up in the funds by the early 80s. The government agencies basically felt overburdened with this unprecedented population of refugees. It wasn't too well planned, to be honest. So, this basically describes the initial phase of settlement for these refugees. Um, in some cases, or many cases actually, these refugees were sent to, let's say, small towns in a small state, population wise. And there wasn't a lot of job opportunities for them in this new host location. Many of them were forced into unskilled positions requiring no English, no training whatsoever. But if you're trying to make them economically independent, economically self sufficient, that's not the way to go, obviously. Okay, so overall, this effort to maintain low visibility, if you will, away from these high visibility areas like the urban areas, all concentrated in one community, for example, was not really working. All right. In fact, it led to tension. So, in some cases, racial tension between them and even other racial minorities in some areas. Okay, so we could also discuss a second phase. If that's the initial phase that I just discussed, right? Wide dispersal. You see a second phase in, let's say, let's say by the late 80s and 90s. Okay. And this is a new phase of settlement, and it involves two migratory processes here: chain migration and secondary migration. Well, let's begin with secondary migration. What does that refer to? It refers to a process of moving from original settlement to a new community. And of course, we're talking about immigrants here. Okay. So we talk about that process of moving from one community, your original place of settlement, to another place. You're talking about secondary migration. All right, so chain migration, on the other hand, is using immigration law to petition relatives in your home country to come over to, in this case, the United States. And we'll talk about the 1965 Immigration Act in our next topic. But basically, this is a big feature of that 1965 Immigration Act for refugees or just immigrants in general to petition relatives for family reunification in the United States. Okay, so this is chain migration when you petition relatives again. So you put these two together. you're going to see how that describes, if you will, the second phase of settlement for these refugees of the second wave again. All right. Um, for example, you'll see a um, a family perhaps deciding to move from, let's say, that small town in, let's say, Kansas, right? Decide to move to a place like Long Beach, California. Why? Because they heard, oh, that a relative is there, right? Or a friend is there. So decide to get away from that initial strategy of the federal resettlement program. After a few years, perhaps even a decade or so, they moved to Long Beach, and therefore they find these ethnic kinship networks that I was referring to earlier. And from there, you see a community form, right, of Vietnamese or Cambodians. Um, and then you put that together with chain migration. You know, you petition relatives come over, and of course, they're going to go to that new place of settlement, Long Beach, for example. So you put that together, and you see how that's going to finally create a critical mass again of a settlement of this ethnic group that again strays away from the initial strategy or described by wide dispersal. Okay, so these two together will influence the creation of um, community for Vietnamese um, Hmong, Cambodians, and Laotians.